Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Who Cares About Justice podcast.
Let me
This is
start. Let me start that
okay.
over. I didn't split the screen. My fault.
That's all right.
Let's go again in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Who Cares About Justice podcast. This is your host, Mark C. McGuire Sr., and I am elated to be talking with you and to you on whatever time of the day it is that you're watching this podcast. But we're excited to be back here again on Who Cares About Justice. This is a podcast of the organization, the Cares Justice Institute Incorporated, the Community Alliance to Restore for Restorative Education and Social Justice Institute. That's us, the Community Alliance for Restorative Educational and Social Justice Institute. And so we're excited to be coming to you right in your living room, in your car, while you're riding and listening, or when you get a chance to sit at home and watch us, just to talk about issues that affect social justice and civil rights. Our job is to come in to inform, impact, and inspire. And we're excited to do that. We are creating conversation and evolving in empowerment around the experience of inequality, injustice, and inequity of Blacks and people of color in America. That's what the conversation is about. We're going to have special guests consistently. We missed July, we took vacation, but we're back for August, and we'll continue on through the rest of the year. Excited about the conversations we're going to have. Why conversations? Because conversation is the impetus to relationships, and good, sound relationships should cultivate both action and power. And that's what we need in America. We need action and we need power. And so, as we continue to look at and consider the plight of people of color, and especially Blacks in America, we have to know that there are some changes that need to be made, but there are also some strides that have taken place, and some progress that we can begin to chronicle, but we still have a lot of work to do. And so we're excited about that. Now, I do know that in most cases, it's about Black men in America and how Black men are being marginalized and how things are seeming to be in opposition against their opportunity for success. And so that seems to be those and the callous of those who are pushing forward. But don't forget, Abigail Adams once said, "Do not forget the women, for within our hearts also burn a passion for justice." And then throughout the civil rights movement, both the first and what we may call the second movement of civil rights, and now in our third movement of civil rights, women have played an amazing role. And of course, they are have been victimized often in the area of justice, equity, and equality. And so on this podcast, we look forward to collating data. We look forward to talking about historical occurrences, current events. We want to look at statistics. We want to talk to experts. We want to find out what's going on. We want to talk to the people who have boots on the ground and people who are actually in the work and doing the hard thing and having the tough conversations that are necessary, and the things that are touching and impacting the marketplace, economics, and things that affect our lives, our social determinants of health, and all the things that make up a human existence in America. And so we're excited. But one of the things that we want to make sure that we also do is we want to champion against the violation of the Imago Dei. That's right. You know, this is me, Bishop Mark C. McGuire Sr. So I am all about the God in each one of us, the purpose that has been born in each one of us, something that needs to come out. And if we find that there is an intrusion of that opportunity, then we have to champion against that cause. And so here's the question: where are we in America? What have we found out? What have we done? What is going on? Because here's the bottom line. Here's probably the statement of all statements: humanity is a right. We have a right to live a humane lifestyle. And one of the things that we deal with on a pretty consistent basis is racism. And so as we deal with that, we want to make sure that we give enough credence, that we give enough attention to the things that would help eradicate structural, institutional, personal, interpersonal, and any level of racism. So, what is racism? It's prejudice, discrimination, and antagonism of one race group over another, where there's an opportunity for superiority with the ability, attempt, intention, or desire to exclude, oppress, or to be injurious. That's racism. And so we've seen it. We've dealt with it. We know that it's real. Words and terms like white supremacy, white fragility, white privilege. We understand it. So how do we deal with it? How do we move forward? How do we coexist? How do we strengthen each other? How do we move forward as a nation? How do we move forward as a community? What do we do about slavery? How do we deal with the post-traumatic slavery syndrome? How do we deal with the things that are affecting people from a mental health standpoint? As I mentioned before, what do we do about the social determinants of health, where we have lack of access, where there's inequity and disparity, where we know that things are taking place that don't afford people the same opportunity as others? And so how do we deal with that? How do we reconcile back from the Reconstruction era, where there was emancipation, where there was due process, where there was voting? And so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were in place, but yet we don't see the fruit of it. We're not seeing the manifestation. We're still seeing voter oppression. We're still dealing with real due process, the criminal justice system. We're still dealing with the fact of freedom and what is freedom, and do we have real freedom? And so we have all of these questions and all of these opportunities for us to deal with. But here's the deal. We can't change what we don't confront. And the problem is we will not confront things until we're convicted within. And so I know one great man said, until this happens to those, or till we become concerned about things that's not happening to us, we won't see real change. And so we're here to try to increase that opportunity for people to help bring real change and to get really involved, because we all have a role to play. We just have to exercise in our postures and positions. So today I want to zero in, and I've said a lot of things, and a lot of things are encompassed in that generality. But one of the things that we deal with is criminal justice reform and police reform. We've dealt with police brutality. We've got national attention about police reform. You've got groups talking about defunding. You've got groups talking about strengthening law enforcement. You talk about different tactics, and we're talking about policies and procedures. We're talking about recruitment and training. We're talking about de-escalation. Well, we're dealing with stress, and we're dealing with approaches and the perspectives and all of those things. And then we get to things like explicit and implicit bias. We start talking about police bias. And so today we're talking about police bias. Is it a myth? Has there been a misunderstanding, or is it being misappropriated? That's the problem. That's the question. That's the thing that we probably need to answer. And it may not have a systemic answer that cures all over the country, but in pockets, in communities. How do we move forward? How do we get to this great place? And so I'm excited. I'm excited about today's guest. And I met her through Zoom, and I'm in Florida and she is in Arizona. It's hot in both places, a different hot. But from my office at home and from her office at home, we're able now through this technology to have a conversation that touches both tips or both sides of the nation, southeast and west. And so we're able to look at what's taking place in the middle of these two slices of bread geographically, and begin to talk about what we see as a mindset, what we see as a turnaround, and where is the paradigm shift going to have to take place so that we can begin to see progress and begin to see things take place in our community that not only we can be proud of, but we can begin to see some fruit manifesting and begin to see a change for the better. We've heard in one administration, there must be change. And then we heard from another administration, make America great again. And now we're in an administration that says there has to be change. But we don't know if it's the same change from previous administration, but we do know it's from the perspective that if America was ever great, when was it great, and to whom was greatness felt, or to whom was greatness dealt. And so we've got a lot of questions, and we've got ends of this paradox, and or paradoxical or paradoxal imagery that we see in America. Is it great? Has it been great? How can it become great? But the biggest question is, how can everyone have the opportunity to be great? And so, from a law enforcement standpoint, we see when we talk about community, oftentimes people talk about community and law enforcement as if law enforcement and the individuals that make up the law enforcement departments are not from the community or not a part of the community. So tonight, today, this afternoon, as you hear this podcast or are able to watch it, we want to kind of talk about civilian community and law enforcement community. It's all a part of the community. You cannot have a community without the cultures that make up the community, or the mountains that make up the community, or the gates that make up the community. And one of those gates is responders. And so that would include our law enforcement. And so I'm excited today. I'm thankful. I'm grateful for the introduction by our producer of the Who Cares About Justice podcast. And I do want to say that even right here, today's podcast is sponsored by True 7 CBD. And so we want to thank them for being a part of this process, and appreciating the work that's taking place and the conversations that must be had. All right. So today, without further ado, now I'm a brother. I love the brothers, and I'm all for it. But my mother was one of my heroes, one of my favorite people in the world, and of course, Harriet Tubman was the first hero that I knew outside of my parents. And so, when I talk about women, I am excited to see women who are moving things forward, shaking things up, and causing change. And so, as I've said before, with no disrespect, I've got on the podcast today another bad mama jamma. Her name is Erica Gaines, and she is the president and CEO of TAC Mobility, controlling the mind and the machine. This is an awesome organization, nonprofit organization that's doing phenomenal work in the community and around the nation. And the job, or the goal, is to heal the racial divide between people of color and police officers through some very intentional opportunities of law enforcement wellness and community dialogue. And so I am thankful, I am grateful to have on the podcast another bad mama jammer, another BMJ. And so we are thankful for Erica Gaines to be here. Welcome, Miss Erica Gaines.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so glad I could join you. So
Well,
glad.
I'm looking forward to hearing the dialogue. You look like, and you are, and I'm sure your significant people in your life would say that. You look like such a gentle woman, but I know there's a fierceness behind you that really pushes you for the work that you do. So I already mentioned that you're president and CEO of a major organization, but talk to me about the journey and what brought you to this place, what pushed you there, and just kind of how did you get where you are?
Um, well, one, let me just say your intro and what you as an organization are trying to talk about is like, you had me sweating over here. I was like, dang, you guys are covering a lot. That's really refreshing to hear that there are organizations that are out there that aren't hyper focused on taking one singular stance and are willing to look at kind of the whole picture. Typically, when I work with organizations that do care about racial injustice, it is very much a one-sided perspective, and that, in my opinion, isn't really equality. So it's very refreshing to hear that that's something that you're considering and that you're focused on as well.
Thank you.
So I got started working alongside law enforcement. I worked for this company where I would end up traveling to different police trainings, and I'm a civilian. I'm not a police officer. So I kind of, not only do I stand out as a civilian when I'm around police officers, but then, also Black women with big curly hair aren't the average police officer. It's what a lot of people would imagine, white males. So I've always kind of like stood out, but somehow have been able to intermingle with this community because of my work. And I guess racial injustice, social justice was never something on my radar. It was something, racism was something that I kind of filed away into my past. I filed it away into my insecurities, but I never thought that I would be where I am today, kind of trying to tackle the issues that I am today. So I'm just kind of like doing my thing, and I'm working sales, I'm making money, I'm doing the things. And I remember I was at an NRA police shootout, and I was in New Mexico, and I'd worked all day. I'm at my hotel, and I see the shooting of Terrence Crutcher, and it was a female police officer, and he was unarmed, and he had broken down. His vehicle had broken down, and it went from a broken down vehicle to him being shot. And at this point, this was around 2016, I believe. At that point, there were becoming increasingly more news stories about officer-involved shootings with unarmed Black male. That was kind of the, I don't want to say, that definitely wasn't the genesis, but that's when mainstream media really started to kind of like pick up on these types of stories, and we were seeing them a lot more. And this was, Black Lives Matter was really starting to kind of like ramp up. A lot of more people were becoming familiar with this movement. And I remember sitting at my hotel, and I was watching this news coverage, and it was the first time that I had seen a shooting of someone that I didn't know that really impacted my emotions. I found myself just beside myself, really going, I don't understand. From my civilian perspective, that looked like injustice. That looked like that should not have happened. I don't understand. And the following day I went to work, and there was this like sort of like murmuring that was happening amongst police officers, which is pretty typical because from their community, media coverage tends to be very one-sided, like we spoke about earlier. And so there's always been sort of murmuring, right? When people are like, how dare these police officers? And it's this. They're going, you don't know what you're talking about, whatever. Well, this was really the first time that I had heard police officers kind of saying to themselves and amongst each other that this was a bad shoot, okay? And that was really the first time that I had heard this language, bad shoot. And I found that to be incredibly insensitive and minimizing of the fact that this gentleman had his life taken on national TV without being able to stand up for himself, right? Or without having his moment in front of a judge. This was just decided for him. This was his future. So at that point, I became very confused because up until that point, I had been working with police officers for about 3 years. No, I am terrible with math. 3 years. And my experience having them in this very vulnerable and safe setting amongst themselves, the people that I had gotten to know was very different than the media coverage and the portrayal of law enforcement as a whole. So I was feeling very perplexed going, I am not comfortable or okay with what I just saw. I'm not comfortable or okay with what I'm hearing police officers say. And I'm definitely not comfortable or okay with what the media is saying about police, because that's not true either. So I took it upon myself to utilize the privilege that I had in terms of my, where I was at in life, like my proximity, and going, okay, if officers trust me, maybe they'll trust me enough to have some candid discussion about race, about community policing, about what are real social issues. What is police bias? Who are you biased against? Are you racist? Can you shoot people in the leg? Why can't you de-escalate better? a lot of these questions that I think a lot of the general public and people from communities of color want to know the answers to. But again, without having those relationships, you're not going to get a lot of honesty. So I started there, and in 2017, I had an FBI training, and they have these large police shooting and use of force simulation training devices,
Yeah.
which you're familiar with too, right?
I am familiar. Yes, they're great.
Okay. So for people who don't know, there's a company called Virtra, and they're actually located here in Arizona. And they have this giant apparatus where it's 320 degrees of reactive screen. It's interactive. So there's various scenarios that they'll play on these large screens. And you walking in, you are the police officer, and you have to respond to these scenarios that are happening just as if you were in it. So you have to call out orders, you have to abide by case law, you have to make sure that you're not violating people's rights. All of this is recorded and will be played back to you. But then you also get to wear this, it's like this shock pack that they put onto your body that will sort of replicate a gunshot or an injury so that you can be reacting along with that. So I do the scenario. It's this domestic violence scene. And the whole thing, I think, takes place in a matter of 2 minutes. I'm riding there. I arrive, and this dispute between this man and this woman is escalating and over the top. And then someone pulls a gun. They shoot. I shoot reactively. And then the whole thing was over. And I remember walking out shaking, and I started crying because I wasn't prepared for all of the emotions that I was feeling from the moment that I'm driving there, listening to dispatch telling me these really sketchy, very vague details that aren't helpful really, to everything happened. And then I'm hurting because I got shot. And I started to wonder for the very first time, I wonder if what folks are seeing or understanding as bias is really a trauma response and something that officers don't have as much control over as we would like to imagine. And that's kind of really
I want to kind of jump in right here. I'm gonna let you finish the story because that's a phenomenal point. Because as a black man put in a scenario in the 320 interactive screen, I walked away the first time as an observer. I walked away like, that's not going to happen to me, because the person that was interacting with the screen got shot because they didn't move fast enough. So I thought to myself, oh yeah, he just don't know what to do. You don't have the trigger finger. And then when it was my turn, I realized that there's a lot of things you got to remember while you're in the middle of an actual incident. You said it: law, case law, rights, policy, procedure. You got to do everything right. The first thing you do wrong, it puts you in the wrong. But your life is at stake. People's lives are at stake.
Right.
And you only have 2 minutes.
Right.
So you and really you only have split seconds, because the moment that person does something. So I just wanted to say very quickly, for those that are listening and watching, that from a second perspective, and for those that know and trust me, that is a very tough situation. It doesn't take away the fact that I think there needs to be some things that needs to happen with police reform, but being in that situation is a completely different animal, if I can say, than sitting on the outside looking in, or waiting until you hear the news and hearing a probably slanted story. All right, I'm sorry.
I have chills right now. That's exactly it. That is exactly it. I walked out saying to myself, there is more to this story than I thought. And I think that that's where a lot of folks don't get peace around this, is because they don't get to ask these questions and flesh out these curiosities, and they don't get to ask officers or get like very they don't get answers from police departments that are in words that they understand.
Right.
People don't get to understand this scenario. It's a very nuanced thing that most people will not get to experience. So when I walked out, I was just going, okay, I think that there's more to this, because all of the questions I had about, like, why can't you shoot him in the leg and why can't I de-escalate? All of that went right out the window. The person that I was speaking with had no intention of being de-escalated.
Wow.
There was no time for me to even think about where to shoot this person when there is a dangerous, hostile situation happening, children are present, and someone has a gun. Shooting someone in the leg was the last thing on my mind. It was a shoot to kill kind of scenario in my mind, but I wouldn't have ever thought of it that way. But I walked out feeling that. And then they played the video back telling me what all I did wrong, like where I violated rights, where I should have gone for cover, and all these components that are just almost impossible for the human body and brain to do well. And that's been the interesting part about my research, is finding out how limited we are as humans. And I think that people forget that component of law enforcement, is that we're still dealing with a human that has limitations. So I like that, and I like what you said about, it doesn't dismiss the fact that reform needs to happen, that accountability needs to be present, but it definitely does add more to the conversation, and it makes it more complex than I think a lot of people want to give it credit for.
Yeah, I think sometimes we've got a wall when it comes to perspective, and because we have our own perspective, and we have our own presuppositions, and we have our own biases, and we have our own truths, because we trusted what someone else said about the other, whatever that is, then it's hard for us to consider anything differently or anything other than what we believe was the reason. And somehow cognitively we think we've got it figured out, and then media really helps push us over the edge.
Definitely, for sure. And then there's also, you mentioned it earlier, having like this post-traumatic slave syndrome. There's so much science behind how fears and responses are passed through our genetics. And there's a lot of that at play, right? Which will disable people from being able to see other sides of the story. But then we also have things like stress hormones and fight or flight, and our emotion centers being at the forefront of our decision making or our thinking abilities. And those are also components to that cloud our judgment of individual incidents. And we also begin to generalize. I do counseling with folks, and I hear couples all the time saying, well, you always and you never. Anytime that I start to hear language like that, that is a person being all up in their feelings, all up in their fight or flight. And as you know, I hate to generalize as well, but there are several individuals within our nation that are not necessarily committed, but aren't aware that chemistry is happening inside their body that is disallowing them to see a bigger picture, which I think being able to see a bigger picture of all of these different working parts that contribute to some of our social issues, I think that will give people some peace, and that will give people some freedom, and that will give people the opportunity to see where solutions within their control exist.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And neuroscience helps us to understand that this flight, fight, or freeze, comes from the sympathetic nervous system, that by the amygdala is looking and assessing situations around us and says, hey, no, we can't confront this clearly. We don't have clear instruction from our brain. We're shutting down. We feel fire, safety's gone. And now every reaction now is probably an adverse reaction, because we can't even think clearly. And when you talk about the stress hormones and the trauma hormones that are pushed through the body now, that not only affects the brain, but begins to affect the actual natural body and
Yeah.
puts us in a real or a pattern of behavior that has to be really unwound and toned down, and if not addressed, could be very dangerous.
Right. And that, and then also our brain, when we're in a state of survival or in fight or flight, it looks for familiarity. That's the way that the brain stays and keeps us safe, is looking for things that feel familiar, because it's essentially going to go through its index of information, all the different codes and pathways that the brain has, and go, okay, we know how this is going to play out. We know how to stay alive. And so I think when people get the slightest sense of police brutality, or we see a shooting, or we get pulled over by police, our brain instinctively and within nanoseconds pulls up frames of reference and says, this is most likely that.
Right.
Even if it's not that. So a lot of times, and this is part of the research that I discovered, a lot of times people are, their brains are working to create situations and essentially manifesting situations that aren't taking place, but because we feel familiar with those, we do. And this is kind of how trauma cycles within our communities work. And it's going, okay, that is not serving anybody. But a lot of people haven't had that education and awareness about how trauma even works in their lives. So what I wanted to do is kind of explore a little bit more, what does trauma look like within the law enforcement community? Like, what do you have control over yourself when you have all of this training? Like, how, when are you just a human? Like, what does that look like? And I heard just a ton of just really traumatic stories from police officers, like very, very traumatized individuals that have taken on these jobs to respond to our community's traumas, and just going, oh my goodness, we have people that are so burnt out on responding to trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma, that there's no way that these people can show up compassionate or empathetic or healthy and like ready and patient. It's just not possible.
Right.
And I think that we forget that, and we assume that we demand that because they're law enforcement and because they have these authoritative roles, that they better not be any type of human. When it's going, well, that's not realistic.
Right.
It's not realistic.
Right. And so we, because we have this epidemic of humanity amongst law enforcement, TAC mobility then brings an essence and a voice to these issues. And I see as I've whistled through Facebook and Instagram, and I'm going to utilize the bed exercise before sleep tonight. I'm going to do the stretching of the hamstring, and I'm going to do all that tonight, lay back, and so I'm going to make that happen tonight. But I saw that law enforcement wellness, community dialogue, we mentioned those earlier.
Yeah.
But you've got three components that I recognize in the bio that really speaks to some more specific things, and then it gets really specific. But you talk about trauma recovery, you talk about self-awareness, and then you talk about suicide. And so TAC mobility then says, okay, we want to focus then on law enforcement from these three areas, trying to build up this humanity in a place that's not living in deficiency, but there's some strength to do the job. So talk to me about trauma recovery, self-awareness, and suicide in any form, fashion, or order.
Okay, so I kind of think about it like this. It's difficult, I think, for a lot of people to sort of like resonate and be able to empathize with police officers, because there's a lot of bad blood, right? So let's kind of like take this from the individual perspective. Let's take police out of it. When we grow up in survival mode, when we grow up and there is danger present, when we don't know when our next meal is coming, when we don't know where our abusers are, when we don't know how safe we are, I want you to try and think about how creative you are. How How affectionate do you feel? How concerned with others are you? Not very.
Not very.
Not very. And that's because our bodies are being flooded with these hormones that are essentially used to arouse the body to keep it safe if it has to move quickly, if it has to think quickly, and it impacts our ability to be creative, right? So I was kind of looking at this perspective of, I know my experiences with racism. I grew up for sure feeling less than, being told that I'm less than, and then looking at my financial situation, looking at my education and going, wow, I'm still kind of far behind everybody, you know? And then I'm looking at police going, hold on a second. If police officers don't care, if police officers don't feel well enough to do this big thing that communities are asking them to do, which is to look at every single case like it's the first case that they've had in the day, like their patience level is through the roof. They're willing to be compassionate. They're willing to take everybody's stories into account, the totality of their experience, and go, okay, I understand why you made that choice. I'm going to think outside of the law or see where I have some wiggle room. Let's see what resources we can get for you. We're asking police to do things that they're not trained to do, and they're stressed out. They're not going to do it.
That's right.
They won't do it. And not because necessarily that they're choosing, but it's the same thing about that survival mentality. When you are flooded with hormones and you're hyper vigilant, your body and your brain don't make space for those creative elements, those thriving elements, those connectivity elements. And that's really what we've been calling for as a community of color. So when I started doing my research about how trauma impacts this community, I heard some of the most devastating stories about suicide within law enforcement communities. Prior to last year and COVID, suicide was the #1 cop killer in America. And I don't think that, one, most police officers didn't even know this. And two, I don't think that people understand that. Right? I don't know too many people that haven't been touched by suicide. If you haven't, like, that's a pretty unique experience, but it's a very uncomfortable and scary and confusing type of topic. And so the more I tried to tackle this topic, the more I heard just really sad stories of people and their divorce rates, or people not being able to connect with their children, and people feeling like they're dead inside because they don't know how to connect with the world if they're not wearing their uniform, you know? And I'm going, hold on a second. I believe in equality. I believe that everybody has a right to live a healthy and well life. I believe that we all deserve prosperity. This is a group of people who are also not experiencing that. Except the thing that I was starting to hear more of, which was becoming disheartening, was people from communities of color, specifically the Black community, then kind of turning the tables on police and beginning to treat them in the ways that we were once treated. And I'm going, I do not stand for that. Mm-hmm. I do not stand for the oppression of anybody. That is not the step to equality. I don't believe that. And so I realized that in order to bridge that gap and to create more community dialogue, we need to support the mental and physical health of officers, so they could just show up to the table. But then we also needed to create that table and pull people to it and say, what is your history? Where are you coming from? What are the things that are, like, historically, what are some of the things that you grew up with that have changed your perspective of humanity, that have shaped your experience in this world? What are you experiencing now? How do you imagine progress in our country? What does equality mean for you? And I feel like we all deserve to have that dialogue and stop this cycle of repetitive behavior that essentially gets us nowhere.
So how do you deal with possibly someone's perspective? They're listening to this, they go to Tech Mobility Online, they hit your Facebook page, they hit Instagram, and they see this interaction kind of consorted with law enforcement, It's kind of concentrated there. How do you
Yeah.
deal with people? I know sometimes people think that I'm turning into a vigilante or radical, and I have to explain
That's
to people
super true.
because because I'm pro-black doesn't make me anti-white.
Oh,
Because I'm also pro-black doesn't make me anti-white. So how do you become an advocate for law enforcement well-being and not be considered or deal with the consideration that you are an opposer of black people in America and the brutality that they are facing and dealing with as a black woman, even more so?
that is, I was not expecting that question, but I am very glad that you asked that, because that is one of my it's not a fear of mine. It's an opportunity that I have been like waiting for someone to approach me with, because from my perspective, I have seen many folks from the Black community that take these spotlight positions and utilize that to take the side of opposing Black people or oppressing Black people or furthering that narrative of like race doesn't exist and, all the things, right? And I absolutely disagree with so much of that. I think that it's a great, I think when people assume that I am anti-Black or pro-cop, I am pro-Black and I'm pro-cop. And it's difficult for people to understand the two because they seem so opposed. But what I found out is that, in my opinion, these are two communities that are more like each other than we would think. Example, I didn't know Terrence Crutcher, had no idea who this gentleman was, but I saw something on the news and my brain started looking for the ways that I've been pulled over, for the ways that I've been judged for my skin color. And I was able to empathize with this gentleman. I understood his experience, and my body flooded me with all of the emotions associated with, had I been in his position, this is what I would have gone through. Police officers all across America are in these states of hypervigilance and stress, and essentially that's adding up and leading to suicide because they're watching their brothers and sisters that look just like them, that have a shared experience, who are being oppressed, and they're going, well, why couldn't that be me? And then their bodies are flooding them with the same bits of information and hormones, which is allowing them to remain on edge and in survival, less receptive to an opposing idea or someone that doesn't look like them giving them their opinion. So from my seat, I was going, no, we are so much more similar than we would like to admit. And both communities have this lack of support and resource from the government, which at some point we all have to stop relying on the government, which is why self-awareness is, to me, this component that has to be present for progress.
Okay.
If we are solely focused on others changing and we don't have the confidence or safety or the resources to look at our own lives, we're not going to know what part we're playing in that. We're not going to know what ignorance we're bringing to the table. We're not going to know what level of unsafety we're bringing to the table. So self-awareness is one of those things that as humanity is concerned, we're just now learning this. We're just now learning how to look at our traumas from our parents and from institutions and from family members that have hurt us, or just ways of thinking that our parents taught us that no longer serve us as we are now. So this is all very new information. And law enforcement, because of their schedules and because of the amount of trauma that they take on from responding to our communities, they don't have the privilege of time. So when folks want to talk to me about or look at me going like, yeah, well, you are anti-Black. No, I think that in order for Black people to thrive and to find success in our country, we need to have everybody on the same page. It means that everybody has to be feeling well. We're not there.
And that's where the wellness of law enforcement becomes an emphasis for TAC mobility, because that's the area that you want to impact. And I think that's what we have to be respectful and honor everyone's intention, because no one group is going to fix everybody, and no one group is going to fix everything about anybody. And
Right.
we have to emphasize, we use in our spiritual culture our highest and best use in order for us to have real impact and to begin to push change. So I saw a phrase there that talks about police bias. Talk to me a little bit about the connection between police bias and the psychological stress responses that take place, uh, where we can eliminate as much as possible, but let's just say, for lack of a better term, or we can dissipate the level of racism that gets the blame for the response of police bias, and really look at it from a place of psychological stress.
You said a lot there. Okay, so here's where my brain goes with that. I'm not quite sure if I'm following exactly where you're wanting me to go with this, but when it comes to the history of racism in our country, and police participation in this, I believe, and I know that police administrations, law enforcement as a whole, has missed this great opportunity to change the narrative. So if we think about racism, and we think about police, the grandfathers of policing, so 3 people ago, right, are still enforcing racist and segregational laws. I have heard stories from my grandparents. I've heard stories from my dad, right? So stories make their way through generations. And what happened in law enforcement that was absolutely corrupt and should not have ever happened, that was this source of discomfort, dis-ease, and rejection from newer generations of police. So you have kind of like the what people think in their mind, like that New York cop that wants to like beat up some dude and just like hush hush about it, right? And then you have these younger generations who are being trained by those police officers, who are growing up with new information about self-awareness, biology, stuff like that, or just progression of the world. And they're going, that's dumb. I don't think that way, whatever. And then we also have this new social pressure that's saying we want changes, we want new policies, we want more equality. So that's happening in the 70s and the 80s. But what's also happening is, or I'm sorry, so what's happening, or what was happening, is new policy changes that made sure that those things weren't happening. And again, this wasn't happening all over the country. So I don't want people to get that misconstrued. But where change was happening, it was never being communicated to communities. So there was this, hey, I know that happened, but instead of admitting the negative impact and trauma that caused, we're just going to create new policies and laws so that doesn't ever happen, right? So that's not a bad thing, right? That you decide that you're going to make new policies and make change happen. That's great. But what happens when you don't verbalize and communicate that to communities is, again, when the brain interacts and it senses familiarity, it assumes that this is that, right? Mm-hmm. So a police officer now that pulls over a gentleman that's Black, to him, this isn't any different than the officers in the 60s that were pulling over people because they were out after sundown. This isn't any different. So it's going, police departments, if you want to see communities coming together and having that communal support, but you are absolutely refusing to admit where your department was 20, 30, 40 years ago, that still have major impact on our DNA today, then you're missing out on a huge opportunity for, again, that community relationship, but also officer safety.
Right.
No one is winning in these scenarios where an officer pulls over somebody, they're feeling traumatized, their brain thinks something is that, they go into survival mode, they're not able to listen to logic, things get escalated, that person gets shot, officer gets shot. No one won.
Right. That's correct. And it's
So,
almost like from a racism standpoint, we see that someone was jogging and they were killed by a white man, and then the black community is screaming and hollering justice, no peace, because people are not being handled the way they were supposed to be handled. And then someone says, well, I just invited a black family over for dinner, and I would never hurt a black man for jogging or running. So you can't make me a racist because I would never do that. Versus that person going out with other blacks saying that was a racist act. Because I think that the problem is, if I just say I'm not racist, but I'm not anti-racist, I help the narrative to maintain. And I think I hear you saying, okay, as a police department, we changed policy, but we never said that was wrong. We just changed it. So we're not going to allow that to take place without accountability, but we never really said we could 100% oppose that, and we condemn it. And I think that's, you're absolutely right. That's some of the problem. I'm not that, but I'm not anti that enough to help change the mindset and help ease the discomfort and ultimately the distrust.
I mean, yes, but also there's this, you kind of said it, you're not anti-racist enough. When there is this, you're not enough, and it's this constant, you're not enough, that's where people begin to get burnt out. One of the things that I've been able to recognize is that in our effort as a Black community to seek equality and to make sure to really snuff out people who are racist and biased, we've used this same narrative and dialogue and approach to this. And really what this has done is, because it's been like a very much a finger pointing and you're this and you're that, because we have people that aren't a part of the community or don't understand the nuances, they don't have that experience. We're going, you're this, you're that, this is what this is. Then you have real humans that are tired of being told who they are and how they think. And what that's actually done is it's taught officers to go, I'm not gonna deal with that. I'm gonna avoid that. I'm not going to go there. So what we've actually done is create a bias, but this bias that we've created is not the same bias that existed then. This bias is more about their safety and whether or not it's worth it for them to approach a person of color. Like my boyfriend is, he's a police officer, but he is drug interdiction. So they're looking for drug traffickers, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, and he does not want to pull over anybody that's Black. Now, there's an issue with that because you can be any color and be dangerous. And if we are not going to be proactive in terms of finding people who are bringing dangerous things to our community, then we're missing the mark of public safety.
Right.
But people are going, I'm not touching that. I'm not going to end up, someone's going to record me. Someone's going to call me a racist. It's going to end up on YouTube. Even if I'm out there doing my job and I am not racist, if I'm anti-racist, it doesn't matter. If it looks like that to people and the media loves that kind of thing, I'm not going to touch it. And so now that's going to come back and hurt our communities, because at the end of the day, we still need safety. And until we have a system that provides safety outside of law enforcement, we're failing ourselves. And that's not the solution either.
That's not it. You know, we had a scenario today where a young man had stolen a car. He was running around with guns. I think it was a crew of them in a predominantly Black community here in Jacksonville. And so the text went out, you know, we need to pray, law enforcement's everywhere, guns are pulled, they're looking for people, this could get dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. And so I moved it to an organization that I am now the executive director of, and say, hey, let's get in front of this. We're violence interrupters. Let's try to find out what's going on. And if we can find the people, let's tell them, hey, either, we don't work with the police. So it's not our job to tell you to turn yourself in, but let's put the guns down. We're interrupters. We're trying to stop the transmission of violence and the spread of violence, and change the norm that violence is okay. And so one of the persons responded like, this is another opportunity for them to kill another black man. And I'm saying, okay, you could be right to a degree that someone would take advantage of this opportunity. But if I didn't steal the car and was running around with an AR-15 and an AK-47, I don't put myself in that position, white, black, brown, or red. The bottom line is the epidemic of violence, and even from another standpoint, the morality of knowledge has been lost, or the disease of the epidemic has overcome someone, and it's not about black or white at this point. And so I heard you when you talked about the enough syndrome, and it was purposely said because after a while, enough or not enough doesn't give me any motivation to keep trying. Because now, if I do or if I don't, it's like it doesn't matter. It's always going to not be enough. There's nothing you're going to be happy with. Everything I try. And then if someone says that, well, you know what? I don't want to do it. I'm not a part of that. Then the other side of that is, well, now you see how we feel. We try. So we never get to a place where we're able to have this mutuality of respect and trust and accountability. And somebody's got to break that. Somebody's got to say, hey, nice try. I appreciate what you did. Thank you. And then the other person says, hey, I'm doing what I can. Is there anything else I can do better? Or how can we, and you've got to have this mutuality or this coming together that says, I appreciate the attempt, and I'm not even going to say what you did wrong, where the other person says, hey, I'm doing what I thought was right, but if I could do better, tell me what that is. And we've got to find that. So my question to you then, is TAC Mobility attempting to also address diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to officers on the force, consideration of women? I saw a lot of Facebook posts about women on the force and what that looks like. And a lot of times when we start talking about diversity and minority, we normally go straight to black, or we go straight to the BIPOC community, and we forget about women in general. And so how do you address the DEI situation?
So it's really interesting because I don't think that the average person that's not a police officer understands how many police officers that make up the community are females or are people from communities of color. I think that people, when they're police are racist, right? When they say the word police, they're thinking of a white conservative male that they view as oppressive, full of white privilege and all the things. And my work got started by only interviewing people of color that were involved with community policing. And what I found was that police officers of color were so, and I hate to use this word, disgusted by people of their own communities of color, calling them Uncle Toms, calling them traitors, stepping in and like standing their ground in this black victimhood of, you'll never change, you're a part of the man, you're a part of this system, you're all the things. And it's going, hold on. In order for us to change communities, we do need diversity. And diversity is happening so much to the point where pressure has been on departments that now there are different, I forget the word that I'm looking for, initiatives that departments are taking on in order to meet these quotas, right? Which we all know there's a difference between diversity and inclusivity. There's a huge difference, right? And that's one of the things that I've recognized within law enforcement is that, let me take law enforcement out of it. As a country, we have become very polarized, us versus them. Mm-hmm. We will ignore the fractures and the toxicity within our own community because we need to survive. We need to stand up for each other. We need to not let the other person succeed. And what happens within law enforcement communities is administrations are going, this person is from the BIPOC community, or this person is a female, we're going to bring them in. But the culture is going to stay the same. Mm-hmm. So essentially, you look different, but you act like me. Right. So I started interacting with officers who, look like me, but then they sound exactly like, a white officer from Kansas. Right. And I'm like, well, hold on a second. You're Puerto Rican and you live in Delaware. Right. What? How does that work? And so I really started going, okay, I know what that's like to show up to work and for my color to be celebrated, but the nuances of what make my experience to be kind of like weird to people. So I wanted to help create a more open dialogue with police administrations going like, you think that you're hitting the mark because you've got people who are brown or Asian or Native or females, but you're not taking into consideration what they bring to the table that you don't. Right. So females in general, females, females, I believe, are going to save this world because for so long we have had this male masculine influence over laws, policies, how we treat people. And honestly, we haven't gotten very far. There's been a lot of things that are not healthy. And when I think about the balance that women can bring to law enforcement and public safety, I get excited over that. But that means that you have to let females be females. You have to not judge
to the point where it's not color. It's I can be a woman full of femininity who is able to be strong enough to be an officer. I don't have to be a woman who acts like the boys, right, in order to be an officer, because now I do have differentiality or I do have diversity, but I don't have value because I have to now morph myself to be you, even though I look different. And that goes from gender to race.
Right. Right. And that puts a person in that fight or flight perspective where they're going, I need to fight for myself. I need to make sure that I can show up. That takes away from the creativity and the natural qualities that someone who's different possesses. So it's important, yes, get people in the door that don't look like everybody else, but also let them be who they are in terms of the actual diversity and like the complexity that they have within them. We're all innate. You talk about Imago Dei. I used to be very much in the church world, and I was looking around going, do we desire diversity? You're talking about how it's important, but do we desire for there to be a difference? Because I don't see that. And so it's in every community. Every community has something that they need to work on. You kind of touched on it a little bit going, if you're not getting involved in illegal activity, then we don't even need to get to the point where we have to ask the questions or saying, oh, here's an officer getting ready to shoot another black male. Let's not get to that point. Let's reflect and hold the mirror up to our community and say, what are some of the things that need to change within our community that are negatively adding and impacting the rest of our country?
Yeah. And I think you said it earlier. I mean, diversity and inclusion are different. And I think a lot of times when we start talking about DEI, we really just get stuck at the D. We really get stuck at diversity and start just hiring people or bringing people in who look differently than the others that have historically or systemically been a part of it. But we're not allowing then the equity for opportunity to take place, nor are we valuing and considering the individual so they can be who they are inside of that culture and they can be accepted. And we've created a system or a model that immediately changes you to be like me, even though you look differently. So we don't really see inclusion a lot of times. And Google did a great job over the last few years about giving a report card about how they move from year to year. Because I think what happens is we have a action plan that we never put into action, and then it's never accountable of how the actions actually impacted the change that was desired.
Yeah. And here's one of the interesting things is that police, whether people think that it is enough, have accountability, but communities don't.
Right. Right. And the accountabilities a lot of times for police, um, I think from a community standpoint, community would say, yeah, that's a self accountability, but not a community accountability. And I think again, that's where we've got to get to this mutual table
Right.
and say, here's what we all agree would be great accountability measures to talk about how we as law enforcement officers are accountable to the community and how community is also accountable to law enforcement
and themselves. And here's the thing, right? I'm out here trying to do this work of helping officers become healthier mentally and physically, but also have self-awareness. They can't show up to the table doing the work and nobody else is.
Right.
Like I did this post and I got a little bit of heat from it, but it's going, we talk about white privilege, but we don't talk about Black victimhood. There are things within our community that no longer service, these narratives that keep us where we're at, that disallow us to experience prosperity and abundance because we're so concerned with saying that it's this person's fault and it's that person's fault. And yeah, I'm not this because of that. Sure. But what are we doing about it?
Right.
Because I'm trying to make the table. So, we need to show up, everybody at their best or trying to be as vulnerable and candid with their own garbage and go, okay, so if police officers are responding to 36 domestic calls in one day, domestic violence, right? Where is the accountability within the nuclear family system? Where is the understanding of trauma that happens when families break up, when molestations happen, when rapes happen, when abuse? Where is this going? Okay, that happened to me. Because that happened to me, I'm also likely to repeat the same behaviors without education. I'm likely to have a shortened temper or have outbursts of anger. I'm likely to abuse my partner because I grew up with that experience. There's no accountability happening from the communal aspect. And then the accountability from a police perspective is without the community's perspective.
Right.
So it's like we all just need to get it together, which is always much easier said than done. But within our own community, I was forced to either be the white girl, right? Because my super dark friends always judged me because I was light skinned. So then I did have to choose who I was going to hang out with because white people, while they made fun of me for all the nuances of having kinky hair or being ashy or having larger legs than everyone else, they still accepted me in, right? So we have to look at our communities and go, what exists within our community narrative and culture that need to go? Like when I think about defunding the police, that is a natural progression of the human experience. If I feel oppressed and I'm saying, hey, I don't like that, please stop that. And my abuser or oppressor is like, nah, deal with it. And the behavior continues. My voice will either get quieter or it's going to get louder. And depending on the response of my oppressor, at some point, I might just be like, screw it. I'm going to get crazy. I don't care about my own safety. I don't care about the actions of myself. I can't win either way. Right. So
Right.
defunding was this natural progression of people of color saying, hey, we feel a disparity within our country, or we feel oppression, or we would like to have reparations, or we'd like to have this, or we'd like to have history discussed in a more open and vulnerable way. And then we have communities who aren't a part of that going like,
Yeah.
was that? I don't
Right.
feel that way anymore. So it's, it's probably not that, right? But those cycles are still continuing. So the voices are getting louder. And then, so we went from Black Lives Matter to police reform. No one's listening. No one's listening, to now we're at defund the police, which is like,
Right.
pardon my French, like, fuck it. Like,
Right.
let's get rid of it.
Right.
You
Right.
don't
Like we don't need it.
Right.
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 Which is a ridiculous narrative, but it's the narrative of the frustrated. Just
That's
like
right.
rioting is the narrative of the voiceless.
That's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's where police are at, which makes me saddened, which is why I created this company, is that officers are too feeling like they are being now oppressed by communities of color that are going, well, you're gonna, and your ancestor did this, and you're most likely this. So they're just going like, okay, like whatever.
Right.
And now it's to this point where they're leaving in droves. The hiring standards for police departments are pathetic.
Right.
They are offering thousands of dollars just to get people to apply. That is not
what we want.
what we want showing
No.
up to our,
No.
like, because these are what I think that people just, what I hope isn't happening, but I have a feeling that it is a lot of people who don't have police interactions or have violent family situations are going, police are doing a terrible job and blah, 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 blah. So you have police departments that are sending unqualified officers, people who don't have life experience, to calls that matter. If I call the police, it is because I could not find balance in my life. I exhausted my own resources to the point that I have to invite someone else into my problems.
Right.
So this matters, right? We don't want people showing up that are 19 years old with no life experience, that are afraid to traverse our problems because they're likely going to end up on the news, or they're going to lose their job, or they're going to get shot.
Right.
We don't
It's
want
got to
that.
be our brightest and best.
Right. And officers
we're losing that opportunity.
That's right. That's right.
And I think that's why the work that you have is so important, because it gives an opportunity for law enforcement officers. I love the Leo. It gives an opportunity for the law enforcement officers to grow and to become strengthened and to find some levels of and I don't want to use the word because we're getting ready to do something right now, and I'm going to ask you about that. So I want to breathe really quickly, and because I have 3 important questions I want to end with. All right. Okay. So you have been phenomenal. And so, I'm going to do the stretching and breathing, and I'm going to put my arm through the keyhole and put my leg back. And I watched it. I watched it twice. I got it. I'm going to cross my leg. I'm going to pull it back. I'm going to do it. I'm going to stretch my head back. Yeah, I got it. So we're going to do that tonight. But I want to do something now called I Say, You Say. All right. Okay. And so this gives us a chance to breathe. So I'm going to say one word, and you got, no longer than 10 seconds to deal with that word. And then we're going to keep moving. And I have 10 of them. So we have 110 seconds just because of lap time or lapse time in between them. So here we go. Number 1, recovery.
Is mandatory. We all need it.
Okay. Stress.
Slowly kills us.
Family.
Is different for everyone.
Leaders.
Are bleak.
Resiliency.
Is learned.
Routine intimacy.
Essential.
Erica.
I love
Anxiety.
is everywhere,
Culture.
is beautiful,
Fun.
fun, is necessary.
All right. Well, you nailed it. So thank you. I say you say. I say you say was sponsored today, co-sponsored today by Tutor Time, Child Development Center, and True 7 CBD. So once again, thank you for the I say you say. So we took a deep breath, we stretched a little bit, found out something. I asked one of the first word that I asked. I do want to address that very quickly, and then I have these three questions to end our time together in what I hope is just session one. I hope there are more sessions to come, and I hope to do some work with you in the future and partner with CARES and TAC Mobility, because I think the work could be very cohesive in making a change and a difference. Trauma recovery. You said recovery. You said is necessary. Everyone needs it. Um, when you talk about recovery and you're not in a rushed situation, um, what is recovery and why is it so essential?
So recovery is going to be different for everybody, but essentially I want people to think about the organism itself, okay? So our brains, which are this juicy thing in our head, it is constantly relaying information to the body.
Okay.
And it does that through hormones. And depending on what information and message it has for the body, it releases a certain type of chemical.
Okay.
So when we are constantly in survival mode or stressed or anxious, thinking about the past, dwelling on the future, whatever the thing is, every thought is associated with a chemical. Thought, chemical, thought, chemical. So if you think about your life and the average tempo of your thoughts, the types of things that you think of, or if you're in an area where your physical experience is dangerous, okay, your body is constantly being flooded with messages of I'm not safe, get up and go, increase heart rate, increase glucose, tense up, get larger, pupils, emotions. That is not sustainable.
Right.
That's not how we live a happy life. That's how our hair falls out. That's how we get giant knots in our shoulders. That's how we get indigestion. That's how we have heart problems. That's how autoimmune diseases can be formed. That's how degenerative diseases can be formed. The breakdown of our body happens every time we experience stress. So when I think about recovery, it essentially has to do with enabling your body to produce the opposite type of chemical, which brings homeostasis or balance to the body. So for some folks, that can look like playing with an animal. For some folks, that can look like taking a walk or doing a yoga class or sitting in a sauna or playing with your kids when you feel well. For some people, that looks like CBD. For some people, that looks like Zoloft, because that helps your body produce connection hormones, okay? So it really comes down to we have to start looking at our bodies as constantly experiencing stress and trauma and needing to love ourselves to the point of balance.
Mm.
So recovery is just, yes, it's important for communities, but at the end of the day, like self-love, self-importance, and self-care, that has to be our priority if we're going to have a sustainable and big impact on the people around us.
Right. And I think for so long, self-care was considered selfishness. And
Right.
even as a minister of the gospel, pastor,
Yeah.
overseer of churches, I realized that if my spirituality isn't in growth mode, it's going to be very difficult to impact and to pour into others, because eventually I'll be depleted and I cannot help others continue to grow. So I've got to be growing myself. I've got to take care of myself. I have to be. I've always said, and there's a book out that says it. But if you're not emotionally healthy, you can't grow spiritually. So even as a minister of the gospel, I realize that I got to keep my mind and I got to do a better job with my body. But I got to keep my mind and my body in a place where there is recovery and resilience that continues to give me a positive impact, because every day stress is trying to dissipate the strength and the vitality that's on the inside of me. So
Yeah.
so that's great. And you've got stretch. We'll talk a little bit about that. So at the very end, and so I may have you adjust something because I want you to do a stretch for us. But I'm going to ask this question, and I wrote it down. So, how does the mental and physical well-being of law enforcement officers develop trust in a despaired, marginalized, and historically abused community?
So one thing that I tell officers is that when you physically feel well, let me say it this way. Okay, so this is something that I stole from my boyfriend. You've probably heard of the reference, like you've got to like fill up your cup. You've got to keep filling up your cup so that it can like pour the overflow. Okay. I want you to think about this as your body's capacity for stress. So as a human, however much is finances, relationship, friendships, whatever the things are stressful in your life, whatever that is. If chronic tension is one of those things, then I want to help you take that out. Because if you're completely full of stress, how much room do you have for something new coming in? None. So you've got to learn how to create some capacity, because your jobs are going to constantly put things in. You have such an important job that you are responding to. So when COVID happened, my son, really all of his pain from the divorce that him and his father and I were going through, it rose to the surface. Like my son had no capacity for COVID and being at home, like stuck at home. And he started acting out and just like wild. I had no control over this child. And there was one day and I was spanking him and he yelled out of the window, like, "My mom is beating me. Help, 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 help." I get a knock on the door and they're police officers. They have to come into my home. They see my house is completely trashed from him. He's like shut off, doesn't want to talk to anybody. This is an important thing in my life, that they don't take this to a level that it doesn't need to, that they're showing up willing to listen to our stories and to calm the situation down. That's what we need. Is somebody else called it, but we need the situation to come down. So what I teach officers is, one, you have to create that capacity within your body to handle new stress so that you can show up ready to deal with things that maybe you're not equipped to deal with or that you're not in the mood to deal with. But then two, being able to discuss what the past is a gift. Because some people are going to want to be like, "Oh, you're just pulling me over because I'm Black," or "You're just doing that because I'm Black," or whatever. I want to arm you and empower you with the ability to say, "You know what? Officers in my department, this is what they used to do. This is what they used to be about. I'm not about that. I'm against that. But I'm here because of this. I want to know why you're doing this. What's going on? What got you here?" So it's not necessarily that I have solutions or I know what they need to do, but it's enabling an officer and it's giving them language to be able to de-escalate this very, very important topic that kind of gets in the way of people in specifically communities of color being able to face what they did that got them there in the first place. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is by doing that and building that capacity, there's a refreshed consistency in the behavior or the interaction that eventually will propel trust in a community.
and not being
That's
able
what I
to,
think
and
you
not being afraid to talk about race. It is
right,
this very uncomfortable thing. And because departments haven't dealt with it for so long, and they for sure aren't training their officers on it as a whole, officers don't know what to say about it unless they are a person of color.
right,
They don't know
right,
how to talk about it. So they just kind of are just like, no, like whatever. And they kind of put up a wall, right? Like I talk in my trainings, I talk to them about microaggressions that communities outside of law
mm,
enforcement say to you that
right,
essentially like make you build a wall.
right.
It's no good.
No good, no good. Thank you. Number two, what do non-enforcement engagements what should they look like in
I
order
know.
to build that trust? So when it's not an enforcement situation with a police officer and we're talking about building trust, give me an example or what TAC Mobility may suggest to a department of what some of those engagements should look like from law enforcement to civilian community when it's a non-enforcement situation.
When you say non-enforcement, like, can you give me an example of what that might
Like
look
I'm
like?
not on a call. I'm not on a call. I'm not here
Okay.
to manage a situation. It's just middle of the day,
Yeah.
either on or off duty.
So what you're talking about is this proactive community policing element, which departments have, in my opinion, have fallen short of. And then in terms of being proactive, again, this comes back to you can't be in survival mode and be proactive. The two just don't coexist.
Okay.
So when it comes to being proactive, if you are only showing up to do what people think you're going to do, then you're missing the mark and you're missing this opportunity to show them that you care about public safety or that you want things to be different. So I encourage officers to talk to people. What do you need? What's going on? What's your greatest challenge? What are some of the issues? Instead of, there's so many theories that police have come up with in ways that they police communities or try and protect people. And I'm like, what? That doesn't make any sense. But it's, again, because when you're trying to make a solution for a community that you're at arm's distance with, you're going to miss the mark because you don't understand the nuances of that specific context. So you have to understand the context of the community in which you serve if you want to have communal support and if you want to change that narrative of it's us versus them. There's a lot of communities. I actually just worked with a chief of police in Claxton, Georgia, which is just south of Savannah. And he's like, we had this big old like town meeting and everybody came and it's a predominantly Black community. And he's like, I showed up and I was just waiting for it. I was waiting for them to roast me. And they said, we want to know how we can support you. And I said, oh,
Wow.
how did you feel about that? And he goes, I was blown away. We thought that they were there to just roast us and tell us how racist we were and whatever. But to know that this community genuinely cares about their safety and want to understand how they can support us completely changed the narrative. People want to be understood. They want their individual stories to be heard and taken into account.
That's right.
All the time.
Yep. To be heard and be considered.
That is the human. That's what we want as humans. We want to be understood and we want to live freely.
Right. We had an initiative in Dayton, Ohio. It was called Speak, Be Heard, and Be Considered. And that was the conversation that took place. And I think it had great progress. There were some things we should have done as action items afterwards. But I think the beginning was set. All right. Last but not least, is racism a targeted area of the self-awareness that TAC Mobility tries to, I don't want to use the word agitate, but calls to appear? Or is racism not a focus?
Say that again.
So as it relates to self-awareness, as it relates to awareness in general with TAC Mobility, what role in causing awareness is motivated by racism?
This is tricky because what I'm going to say might lose some people, but I have learned something about myself in terms of racism and whether or not I believe it still exists or what that looks like. I, for the longest time, walked into a room assuming that the first thing that somebody thought of was she's Black. Mm. And I approached all of my relationships, and because I was treated a certain way by the Black community, there wasn't a single person that I didn't assume was thinking about my skin color. Now, probably after, I don't even remember the last time that somebody said something that was racially insensitive, but it's been at least a decade. Okay. But I realized that it's still this fear and this narrative that my brain is thinking. And that caused me to think about how neural pathways and brain coding work. So if we grow up so think about it, if we're adolescents and our experience is that people are judging us or being racist towards us or making insensitive comments, our brain creates this understanding of the world. Now, this understanding can be a very adolescent experience, right? So without world experience, without wisdom. But depending on my life from that point on, either life is going to confirm that that's true or it's going to prove that that's wrong, right? If you're in a community where you grow up and people are racist against you and you're being told that police are racist and they're out to take people from their families, but you are growing up in an experience where someone in your family is not upholding the law and they're interacting with police, that's going to tell your adolescent brain, oh yeah, that's true. That's true. This is real. And then you continue to grow up with this understanding of this is how the world is. This is how the world is. And then your brain looks for familiarity. So it looks for stories and things to confirm that. This is confirmation bias. So what I began to wonder about myself was how much of my understanding of racism was formed at an adolescent age, but no longer exists. But it is this thing that I continue to search for and try to make true. So when I am working with officers, I am less focused on racism in terms of how you are now. I definitely think that departments need to talk about racism that happened from a systemic level that they were enforcing. But when I'm working with an individual officer, it's more important that I talk about the things that you're ignorant to, the things that you don't understand about the world because of the way that you were raised and the things that you've been exposed to, because ignorance is what oppresses other people.
Right.
So for me, I have become less focused on racism because that doesn't exist in my life. So it is more about be aware of the world, be aware of yourself, be aware of how you participate in these narratives that other people have. Be aware of how you negatively participate with these trauma cycles and be willing to speak up about these things. So it's less about racism and more about dialogue and understanding what you don't understand.
Yeah, and I get that. And that's great. And I think one of the things that CARES tries to help in the awareness piece and even in the knowledge space, because there are ignorances that are just there because I wasn't exposed to that.
Right.
And sometimes I don't know what I don't know.
Right.
I mean, I just, this is what I thought I was supposed to know, and this is it. But you know, those levels of racism, interpersonal, personal, institutional, and systemic and structural racisms that people may be a part of, that they don't even understand that they were a part of. They never considered it until it was exposed. Then it's like, oh my God. There's a covert racism that would be like lynching, and then there's the overt racism is like lynching. Then the covert racism, which we may never understand or even know until someone says it. And you use one of the most fantastic words of our decade now, microaggression, and the fact that there are certain conversations that take place that would fit in a racist tone or a place of white supremacy. And
Right.
so those things sometimes have to be exposed. Um, but we love the focus of TAC Mobility. We love the interest of making sure that there's trauma recovery,
Yeah.
self awareness, those things that are necessary for officers, so that they can. And I saw that the empowerment and the enabling ability, so that there is compassion and courage. And I love that. That there is empathy and protection.
Right.
And that's a dynamic
Yeah.
combination, for there to be empathy and protection, and
Yeah.
then ultimately a space for positive community engagement. So we want to say thank you. This is session one, I'm sure, but we want to say thank you to you, Miss Erica Gaines, because we believe tech mobility is going to hopefully spread and become contagious. And it's going to put, I think, stronger, wiser, recovering, resilient officers in the field, because we do need to make sure that the culture is clean when it comes to policing, but also that the culture is fair when it
Yeah.
comes to the police officer. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes it gets contaminated because there is a level of unfairness to those officers who quote unquote would never think
Right.
of doing some of the things that we have lumped them into a group of people that are doing those things. They would never think about that. They grew up wholesome. They grew up with morals. They grew up Christian or with religious values. They grew up with just good home training. They value
Right.
people. They don't see um, black and white in negative or less positive views,
Right.
but they do see black and white. They know it's different. They know that there's people of color, and then they know that there is um, a what I would call a dominant culture in America, but they don't look at it in a suppressing or oppressing way. But
Yeah.
they get lumped in, and the partner may have been like that, or they may have been in a situation that projects that.
Yeah.
In the
Yeah.
criminal justice system, sometimes you don't have to plead guilty to be guilty. You just can't fight it. There's nothing you can say against the evidence. So you take that particular plea, and you really weren't guilty. That was not your intention, but
Yeah.
that's what happened. But we thank you because we know that the work is going to have an impact. So
Thank you.
with those things, compassion and courage, and empathy and protection, the stretching, the recovery, the self awareness, um, the psychological stress responses that are being addressed, and looking at things like suicide and trauma and self awareness and wellness altogether, mentally and physically. What would be the last thing that you would want to say to those that will listen to this podcast if they never had an opportunity to hear words from your mouth again? If your voice was unable to be heard again, what,
It just got dark.
what would you want them to hear you say as it relates to law enforcement officers and the relationship to civilian community?
There's more to the story.
Wow,
There's
that's
just there's more to it. Like my story is complex. I we didn't get into it, but like I was raised as a pastor's kid in the Jehovah's Witness cult.
mm,
Like my story and being excommunicated and not having family and having abandonment issues, all of that matters. That's
mm,
going to play a huge part in the way that I see the world and the way that I interact with the world. Every person in this country, doesn't matter what community you're a part of, has a story
mm,
that greatly impacts how they experience the world and how they want to experience the world. And everyone deserves to be heard. Like The idea, like, Black Lives Matter, like that saying, like, our lives matter. Everybody's lives matter, which I hate that, like, all lives matter was like in response to that, because the message of that, it is true, but like there's more to the story. There's more to somebody's behavior that we can look at as criminal, as violent, as one-sided. There's more to that story.
Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Erica Gaines, the latest edition of the Bad Mama Jammas, represented on the Who Cares About Justice podcast. Miss Gaines, once again, we thank you so very much for being with us. We look forward to the work that we'll do together, and we look forward to having you back on Who Cares About Justice. Thank you, and God bless you. So, for our statement of responsibility, and as we end this very dynamic podcast, it was a lengthy podcast, but it was very informative and inspirational, and I believe impactful. And I think that shared amongst law enforcement, amongst the community, civilian community, lawyers, judges, civil rights activists, social justice, um, people who are looking to help make change, police reform, committees, and all of those. I think you heard some great things. And I think TAC Mobility would be a great asset to any community as it relates to trauma recovery for officers, self-awareness, and engagement, where we begin to see, which I thought was a poetic combination of empathy and protection. That's ultimately what we're looking for from our law officers, our law enforcement officers, which is a very difficult situation with the stress and trauma that they have. But that's real civility, that you would give them the fair opportunity to show it, and that they would desire to have it when they have to engage us. So once again, thank you for being a part of the Who Cares About Justice podcast. Once again, this is your founder and executive director and CEO of the Cares Justice Institute Incorporated. And on behalf of our great board of directors, where the Honorable Judge Walter H. Rice is our president, and we have just a phenomenal board where Mr. David Greer is our vice president, Dr. Robert Walker is our treasurer. The board members consist of my wife, Dr. Angela McGuire, our bishop and pastor, Bishop Vaughn M. McLaughlin, Apostle Arthur McGuire, Pastor and Bishop Angela Cottrell, and Miss Bonnie Beeman Rice, who is a retired judge and lawyer, who is also the wife of Judge Rice. It's just a phenomenal, phenomenal crew that have come together in Dayton, Ohio to make a difference in your community there in Dayton, Ohio, Montgomery County, but to begin to spread this opportunity throughout the world. And so we are thankful and honored to serve you, and we look forward to future podcasts, future opportunities to serve our community. And when we talk about racism, we must say that removing racist structures and cultures is not the responsibility of Black people or other minorities growing up in communities that have historically been marginalized. But those who are non-Black must listen to the lived experiences and voices of those individuals willing to share their plight. But it's not the job of the victimized and the oppressed to dismantle the forces that have marginalized them and these BIPOC communities. Rather, dismantling racism is the responsibility of all non-Black people in their own families, on their jobs, in their places of worship, and in their communities and marketplaces. I might have to agree that in our lifetime, racism may not be eradicated, but I must also emphasize that during our time, it can no longer be tolerated. Hey, once again, this is your host, Mark C. McGuire Sr. This has been another Who Cares About Justice broadcast podcast, and I'm excited and very thankful for our very special guest, Miss Erica Gaines. So once again, thank you for tuning in. God bless you, and remember, let peace be still. God bless. All right. We can't hear you. Can't hear you, T.
I think if I end the broadcast, it'll cut us all off. So when I edit it, I'll cut this back end off.
Okay. Okay. Well, Thank you. That was hot. That was great. I appreciate your time, your energy. I was going to slow down if you slowed down, but you didn't slow down. So
I got really emotional at the end. Just like I have so much hope in my heart for progress. And like I had this moment of feeling just very proud of my effort so far, and just knowing that there are people out there who are also trying to get to the bottom of justice and equality. Like that's big. That's so
well, you're doing a phenomenal job. I pray that somehow we can be involved and kind of hang around the progress. And I'm sure Tavares is going to make sure that when he's got this all edited and ready to go up, it'll go up on the 28th of the month. But you know what, Tavares, I think we can push this one up, and I'll come back and do Mark, and Mark can go up on the 28th of the month. But I think since we missed July, man, we can just come in with a special deal, and then you could just send once it goes up, you could send Erica and myself the copy, and Erica, feel free to share it on any of your mediums, your platforms, with your group. I mean, we want you to share it. If you think it's worth it,
yes.
you share it.
Yes, this was a great yes.
Okay. T, what you think?
Listen, y'all were, I mean, just like highly intelligent, no BS, just quality conversation and words that people needed to hear. I mean, it was progress, man. It was powerful for sure.
Well, praise God. Okay, well, I appreciate that.
Yeah, I was expecting it to. I knew it was going to be here, but it was like there.
Yeah, well, great.
I started getting sweaty.
Great.
I had to like pull some of the sweat off my back, and oh my gosh, I was.
Yeah, I think in our next session we'll I think we could. I don't, whenever that time comes, maybe toward the end of the year. I don't know what your schedule would permit. But there are some things that I felt, and I made myself a note, and I made myself some notes on my phone where I could feel your passion growing. And I really wanted to, and I don't want to use the word wrong, but I wanted to agitate that a little bit, because I think the passion towards it is going to be really good.
Yeah, I'm here.
And then I forgot to get my stretching exercise.
Not too many people want to like challenge me. Like most of the people that I interviewed, Tavares, you were the first person to like ask me questions that I've never been asked. Like people, like my message is so widely accepted in the police community, and it serves them because I'm advocating for them. I don't get to interact with people. I either interact with people who shut me down because they think that I'm anti-Black, and they think that I'm like the next whatever lady on Fox with straight hair that's brown. Or I've got Tavares to ask me like my first couple of questions. So this is challenging. Like this is what I want. Like I do want to have to consider what I really think about that. Am I wrong? Like, have I thought through that? I don't know. Like I welcome the opportunity to learn more about how we can bring actual solutions, and not too many people want to give me the time of day. So I think I'm here for it.
Okay, that's good. We have the sensitivity and the danger of the cancel culture, where they hear something they don't like and they just immediately dismiss you.
Yeah.
And then your real voice doesn't get heard. But I think for what we're intending to do, I think that, even if there's a few people for either one of us that would do that, I think we have enough support from people who do understand us that would say, hey, yeah, let me take a look at that. Let me hear that again. Let me see what they're talking about, and maybe be able to create something. Because I could kind of see a conversation, Tavares. I would love to see a conversation that takes place where somebody else is posing questions that could seem opposing, and we could find these solution-based outcomes of mutuality and responsibility and accountability, where we can say, okay, well, you need to do this, but then we come back and say, okay, I'm willing to do this, and I'm willing to do that. And so, because I think that's what people need to see, that, hey, we don't have to start off the same. We don't have to have a common ground, but eventually we need to end in a willingness to blend so that we've got a better America. So,
yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I think we'll look to record again that Wednesday, November, I think it's Yeah, November 10th. And we'll do it in the studio.
Okay, fantastic.
And then I'm gonna take Erica to serve with me on the north side.
Okay,
What does
okay.
that mean? Is this where Jean works?
It's actually in her area code, but I ask her about where I'm gonna take you. Just tell her what I said. She'll tell you about it.
Okay, I'm excited. I'm excited.
Yeah, it'll definitely be a good time. But nah, like what I enjoyed the most is like and I didn't feel that P Mac would be able to ask you a question that you wouldn't have something for, but he pulled out like just some highly intellectual questions, and I was just on the edge of my seat with your response. So for some reason I've been running to like law enforcement officers on the golf course and at the gym and different things like that, and I always turn them on to the podcast that you and I recorded, and the ones that have been listening as soon as this one comes out is going to be the same.
I got a lot of good feedback. So I put that on my profile. Like I have like a little interviews link, and I got a lot of good feedback. And officers, in my experience, are so open because they trust who I am to hear conversations like that. So for you to ask me those questions, like that is where the growth happens on the other side is, okay, they know that I'm not there to like weaponize and use, their stress statistics against them. I'm there to help. But like at the same time, we're not going to be victims to our circumstance. We are going to become aware of the things that we're ignorant to. Like, I love it. I loved it.
Well, I appreciated it. I appreciate it.
That was so fantastic. I was so proud of that. Like I like teared up at the end and I was just like, I am so damn proud of this conversation that just happened. Like I'm so proud of it. And I know it's just talking, but from my experience, like that's where it all starts. Like
that's where it starts. Conversation.
Yeah.
Sweet. Well, Travars will do his magic. He'll bless it. So we're looking forward to it. They'll have a little music on it and everything. So
I just got to figure out when we're going to drop it. I'm not quite sold on that yet.
Okay.
I'm here for it.
Yeah. Well, you got it. So it's yours now.
All right, my dudes.
All right. Y'all have a great night.
All right.
Bye.